I never expected our paths would cross. Me, scrubbing floors after hours. Him, working late in his corner office. One spilled coffee, one genuine conversation, and my life changed forever. I went from cleaning his office to sharing his life. This is my unexpected love story. Before the designer handbags and penthouse views, before the charity galas and private jets, I was just Maria, a 27-year-old woman with calloused hands and perpetual exhaustion in my eyes. Each night, I'd slip on my grey uniform with the cleaning company logo, pull my hair into a tight ponytail, and prepare for another 8 hours of emptying trash cans and scrubbing bathroom tiles in the downtown high-rise that housed Maxwell Industries. If you've ever felt invisible or underestimated, my story will show you that life can change in unexpected ways. Keep watching to see how I went from cleaning offices to living a life I never imagined possible. I still remember the smell of those industrial cleaning supplies, that harsh lemon scent that clung to my skin long after my shift ended. Back then, luxury meant treating myself to a cup of coffee from the actual coffee shop instead of making instant at home. It meant not checking my bank account before buying groceries. It meant maybe, someday, having enough saved to take night classes and escape the cycle of paycheck-to-paycheck living that had defined my existence since I was 16. My tiny studio apartment was all I could afford on my cleaner's salary. A mattress on the floor, a wobbly table with mismatched chairs I'd found on the curb, and a single window that overlooked the brick wall of the neighboring building. The ceiling leaked when it rained, and the heating was unpredictable at best. But it was mine. The first place I'd had all to myself after years of couch surfing and shared rooms following my mum's death. What you're about to witness isn't some fairy tale where a handsome prince rescues a downtrodden maiden. This isn't a story about being saved. It's about being seen, truly seen, perhaps for the first time in my life. It's about discovering that sometimes love finds you when you're not looking for it, in the most unexpected places, with the most unexpected person. I never planned to fall in love with Daniel Maxwell, CEO of Maxwell Industries, and technically my employer. I never imagined that one day I'd walk into that same building not as someone invisible, but as someone who belonged there. The journey from emptying his trash to sharing his name wasn't simple or smooth. There were tears, doubts, whispers, and moments when I nearly walked away from it all. In the next half hour, I'll take you through every step of this unexpected journey, from our first midnight encounter over a spilled cup of coffee to the day I walked down the aisle. I'll share the ugly truths, the beautiful moments, and everything in between. Because while my story might seem like a modern Cinderella tale on the surface, the reality was far more complex, challenging, and ultimately rewarding than any fairy tale could capture. This is the story of how I went from office cleaner to CEO's wife, but more importantly, it's the story of how I discovered my own worth along the way. Growing up in the east side of the city, luxury meant having electricity that didn't get shut off and a fridge that wasn't empty by month's end. My mother raised 3 kids on a waitress's salary after my father left when I was 8. I learned early that dreams cost money we didn't have, and that hard work didn't always equal a way out. By 16, I was juggling school and a part-time job at the local diner. When Mum got sick my senior year, I took on more shifts, watched my college acceptance letters gather dust on our kitchen counter. The day I was supposed to be moving into a dorm room, I was instead arranging a payment plan with the funeral home. At 19, I became the guardian for my younger siblings, Maria and Tommy, 15 and 12. The cleaning job at Maxwell Industries came 3 years later, after a string of minimum wage positions that never quite covered our expenses. $17.50 an hour, night shift, full benefits. The job posting felt like winning the lottery. I remember calling my sister, breathless with excitement. "We can get you braces now. Tommy can join that soccer league." Night shifts meant I could be home when my siblings returned from school, help with homework before catching a few hours of sleep, then head to work while they slept. It was exhausting, but there was dignity in it. Pride. I was keeping our little family afloat. My shift started at 11 p.m., when the sleek glass-walled offices emptied of their daytime occupants. I'd arrive with my cart of supplies, nodding to the security guard, Mike, who was usually the only person who acknowledged my existence. The executive floor was always last on my rounds. 52 offices to vacuum, dust, and tidy before the business world awakened. There's an intimacy to cleaning someone's space. You learn things about people from their trash, from the photos on their desks, from how they leave their space at day's end. Some executives were slobs, leaving coffee cups everywhere, paper scattered like fallen leaves. Others were meticulous, leaving typed notes. "Please don't move anything on my desk." I knew which offices belonged to parents, artwork from children taped to cubicle walls. Which ones were going through divorces, crumpled tissues, wedding rings suddenly missing from their usual spot in the little dish while they washed their hands. Who was dieting, who was sneaking cigarettes, who was having an affair with someone from accounting. But the corner office, Daniel Maxwell's office, was different. Minimal, organized, but not cold. Books everywhere. Real ones, well read. A single photo of an elderly woman I assumed was his mother. No wife, no kids in frames. He worked later than anyone, but his trash was never overflowing, his desk never cluttered. I'd save his office for last, vacuuming in the dim light cast by the city beyond his floor-to-ceiling windows. Sometimes I'd pause to look out at that view, all those glittering lights, the world I cleaned for but wasn't part of. I'd allow myself a moment, just one, to sit in his ergonomic chair, to feel what it might be like to belong in a room like that. Never did I imagine that one day I actually would. It happened on a Tuesday in November, the kind of night when rain pelted against the windows and the wind howled between the skyscrapers. Most employees had left early to beat the storm, but as usual, the light in the corner office remained on. I'd grown accustomed to working around Daniel Maxwell without actually interacting with him. He'd acknowledge me with a distracted nod when I entered, then return to whatever document had captured his attention. We existed in the same space, but different worlds. That night I was tired, more tired than usual. Tommy had a fever, and I'd spent the previous night applying cool compresses to his forehead between fitful attempts at sleep. My sister had an important exam, so I'd covered for her at her weekend job. 3 shifts back-to-back had left me running on fumes and convenience store coffee. I remember the squeak of my cart's wheels as I pushed it into his office, the weight of exhaustion making even that simple task feel monumental. Mr. Maxwell was hunched over his computer, suit jacket discarded, sleeves rolled up, tie loosened. He looked almost human that way, less CEO, more just a man working late. I started with the trash bin, then moved to dust the bookshelves. The office was silent except for the tap of his keyboard and the soft swish of my cloth against mahogany. And then, a crash of thunder so violent the building seemed to shudder. I jumped, my elbow knocking into his desk, sending his coffee cup flying. Dark liquid splashed across important-looking documents, pooling on the glass surface of his desk. Time froze as we both stared at the spreading stain. In that moment, I saw my job disappearing, saw the disappointed faces of my siblings when I told them we'd have to cut back again, saw the unpaid bills piling higher. "I'm so sorry, Mr. Maxwell," I stammered, frantically grabbing tissues from my cart. "I'll clean it up right away. I'm so sorry." I expected anger, irritation at minimum. Instead, he surprised me by laughing, a genuine, deep laugh that crinkled the corners of his eyes. "Well," he said, running a hand through his dark hair, "I've been staring at those quarterly reports for so long. I was starting to hate them anyway." You might have done me a favor." He stood up and helped me mop up the mess, our hands occasionally brushing as we worked. Up close, I noticed things I hadn't before. The faint lines around his eyes, a small scar above his right eyebrow, the way his expensive watch looked too heavy for his wrist. "You're here every night," he said suddenly. Not a question, but an observation. "Yes, sir. Night shift." "Maria, right." He gestured to my name tag, and I felt a jolt of surprise that he'd bothered to read it. "That's right. Do you have time for a coffee, Maria?" To replace the one you just saved me from drinking. It was cold anyway. The question was so unexpected I almost laughed, thinking it was a joke. But his expression was genuine, curious even. I'm on the clock, Mr. Maxwell." "Daniel," he corrected, then glanced at his watch. "And it's nearly 2 a.m. I think the corporate world will survive if you take a 15-minute break." That first conversation in the break room was awkward, stilted at first. Me, perched uncomfortably on the edge of a chair in my cleaning uniform. Him, leaning against the counter, seemingly unaware of the absurdity of the CEO making small talk with the night cleaner. But somehow, as the rain continued to beat against the windows, the conversation found its rhythm. We talked about the storm, about the city, about the book he'd been reading that I'd noticed on his desk. Not once did he mention my job or his. Not once did I feel like he was performing charity by speaking to me. When I left his office that night, something had shifted, though I couldn't have named it then. All I knew was that for 15 minutes, I hadn't been invisible. I had been seen. After that rainy night, things changed subtly. Daniel didn't suddenly start waiting around for me or making grand gestures. It was quieter than that, more gradual. He began leaving his office door open when I arrived on his floor. Sometimes he'd ask my opinion on which tie looked better for an important meeting the next day. Other times, he'd simply offer a genuine, "How are you tonight, Maria?" The kind of question that invited a real answer, not just a polite fine. I found myself looking forward to those brief interactions, planning my cleaning route to end with his office when I knew he'd still be there. Sometimes I'd bring an extra coffee from the break room. It was just sitting there, I'd lie, and he'd accept it with a smile that made something flutter in my chest. We'd talk while I cleaned, casual conversation that felt strangely comfortable despite the obvious power imbalance between us. He never made me feel less than, never spoke to me with that condescending tone so many executives used with support staff. Instead, he seemed genuinely interested in my thoughts, my perspective, my life outside these walls. "You're raising your siblings?" he asked one night after I mentioned needing to leave on time for Tommy's parent-teacher conference. The surprise in his voice wasn't judgment, it was admiration. Slowly, I shared pieces of my story, Mum's cancer, the abandoned college plans, the juggling act of being sister and parent and provider all at once. He listened without interrupting, without offering unsolicited advice or pity. Just listening, a gift I hadn't realized was so rare until he gave it. In turn, I learned about him, not the press release version, but the real Daniel. How he'd built Maxwell Industries from his father's failing manufacturing business into a technology leader. How the pressure of hundreds of employees depending on his decisions kept him working until these late hours. How loneliness was the unexpected tax of success. "People see the position, not the person," he admitted one night, staring out at the city lights. "Every interaction is layered with what someone wants from me." "Not this one," I replied without thinking. "I just want the trash emptied and the surfaces dusted." He laughed then, a real laugh that made me feel like I'd won something precious. The night he asked about the book in my bag was a turning point. I'd been reading during my break, a dog-eared copy of East of Eden I'd found at a thrift store. Steinbeck, he noted, gesturing to the cover. One of my favorites. That conversation lasted well past my usual cleaning time in his office. An animated discussion of themes and characters that made me forget momentarily about our different circumstances. When I finally glanced at the clock and gasped at the time, he looked genuinely disappointed. The next night, a brand new copy of The Grapes of Wrath sat on my cleaning cart with a simple note. Thought you might enjoy this one next. De. Small gestures accumulated like gentle snowfall. A birthday card when he somehow discovered the date. Genuine concern when I came to work with a cold. An extra umbrella left by the security desk on rainy nights with my name on it. Of course, people noticed. Whispers followed me through the halls. Speculation about what the CEO could possibly want with someone like me. Some were cruel, assuming the worst. Others were merely curious. Mike, the security guard, became a protective ally, warning me about office gossip. "Be careful," he said one night. Not saying he doesn't mean well, but men in his position. I understood his concern, but Mike hadn't seen what I had. The vulnerability behind Daniel's success. The genuine respect in his eyes when we spoke. This wasn't about power or convenience. This was about two people recognizing something in each other that the rest of the world missed. Still, I kept my guard up, reminded myself not to read too much into kindness. He was my employer, after all. These conversations, these moments, they were temporary brightness in otherwise separate lives. At least that's what I told myself, even as I found myself thinking about him during the day, looking forward to our brief encounters with an anticipation that frightened me. Then came the night that changed everything, when the careful boundary between employer and employee, between his world and mine, finally blurred beyond recognition. It was my birthday, my 28th, and I hadn't told anyone at work. I'd planned a small celebration with my siblings over discount store cake before my shift. But when I arrived at the office building that night, Mike the security guard handed me an envelope with my name written in a now familiar handwriting. Inside was a note: roof access, midnight. Dress warm. D. My heart raced as I debated what to do. This was different from our casual conversations in his office. More deliberate, more personal. I finished my rounds early, changing from my uniform into the jeans and sweater I'd brought for after work. At midnight, I took the service elevator to the roof, nervous energy making my hands tremble. The door opened to reveal the rooftop transformed. String lights created a warm glow against the night sky. A small table was set with 2 chairs, a bottle of wine, and a simple vase holding a single daisy. Nothing ostentatious, nothing that screamed, wealthy man trying to impress. Just thoughtful, perfect. Daniel stood at the edge, looking out at the city panorama. When he turned, the expression on his face, relief, happiness, anticipation, told me everything I needed to know about whether I'd made the right choice in coming up. "I wasn't sure you would come," he said simply. "I wasn't sure I should," I replied honestly. He gestured to the table. "Just dinner. 2 people who enjoy talking to each other. Nothing more complicated than that, unless you want it to be." That night we talked for hours, the city lights our backdrop. He'd ordered from a local diner rather than some fancy restaurant, somehow knowing I'd be more comfortable with comfort food than foie gras. He'd remembered casual mentions of things I liked from our conversations. The cake he'd brought wasn't elaborate or expensive. It was homemade, slightly lopsided, with "Happy Birthday Maria" written in imperfect frosting. "You made this?" I asked, incredulous. "Tried to," he admitted, rubbing the back of his neck sheepishly. "YouTube tutorials make it look much easier." That vulnerability, that willingness to be imperfect with me, was what finally broke down my remaining walls. Our first kiss happened under those string lights, with the taste of chocolate cake still on our lips. It was gentle, questioning, giving me every opportunity to pull away. Instead, I found myself moving closer, my hands resting tentatively on his shoulders as his arms encircled my waist. The weeks that followed were a careful dance of getting to know each other outside the office. He never came to my apartment, sensing my embarrassment about my modest living situation without me having to voice it. Instead, we met in quiet restaurants, in neighborhoods where neither of us would be recognized, took walks in parks, away from the business district, spent evenings in the back rows of movie theaters. Our worlds began to blend in small ways. I introduced him to my siblings, watching anxiously as Tommy grilled him about his intentions, and Maria assessed him with suspicious teenage eyes. To his credit, Daniel answered their questions seriously, treated them with the same respect he showed me. The first time he invited me to his penthouse apartment, I almost chickened out. Standing in the private elevator with my second-hand dress and drugstore makeup, I nearly pushed the button for the lobby instead. But when the doors opened, I found him in the kitchen, apron on, cursing over a smoking pan, music playing too loud for him to hear my arrival. Seeing him like that, human, imperfect, calmed my racing heart. Of course, reality couldn't be kept at bay forever. The first photo of us together appeared on a gossip website 3 months into our relationship. Maxwell Industries CEO slumming it read the cruel headline above a grainy image of us leaving a restaurant. The comments were worse. Speculation about what a man like him could possibly see in someone like me beyond the obvious. I cried that night, old insecurities flooding back. Daniel held me, his anger at the publication evident in his tense shoulders and clenched jaw. "They don't know you," he whispered fiercely. "They don't know us." The public scrutiny intensified when he took me to a company function as his date. I spent hours preparing, terrified of embarrassing him. The looks when we entered, surprise, disdain, curiosity, made me grip his hand tighter. But Daniel stood tall, proudly introducing me to business associates, keeping me close as we navigated the room. One woman, the wife of a board member, cornered me by the restrooms. "Whatever you think you're doing, it won't last," she said with artificial sweetness. Men like Daniel eventually returned to their own kind. I'd like to say I had a witty comeback, but the truth is I fled to the bathroom, fighting tears. When Daniel found me, I confessed my fears. That I was temporary, a novelty, something he'd eventually outgrow when he remembered the differences in our positions. His response was to take my face in his hands, eyes serious. "Do you know what I see when I look at you, Maria? Not someone beneath me. Someone who rises above circumstances that would crush others. Someone who sacrifices for family without resentment. Someone who sees the real me, not the CEO, not the bank account." His voice broke slightly. "If anything, I'm terrified I'm not good enough for you." That night, as stars shone over the city and traffic moved below, we made love for the first time. Not in his luxurious penthouse, but in my tiny apartment, with its creaky floors and thin walls. His choice, his way of saying we were equals in this relationship, that neither world was more valid than the other. Lying there afterward, his arm around me, I realized that what had begun as an unexpected connection had grown into something neither of us had been looking for, but both of us desperately needed. A love that saw beyond circumstances to the person underneath. The proposal wasn't grand or public. No restaurants, no audiences, no diamond ring boxes hidden in desserts. It happened on a Wednesday morning in my apartment's tiny kitchen. I was making coffee in my pajamas, hair unbrushed, when Daniel, who had stayed over, suddenly took my hands in his. "I had this whole plan," he said, looking nervous in a way I'd never seen before. "Dinner, music, the works. But watching you just now, just being you, I don't want to wait another day." He knelt down on my linoleum floor. "Maria, will you marry me? Not because I can give you a different life, but because I can't imagine my life without you in it." The ring he pulled from his pocket wasn't flashy or ostentatious, a simple emerald surrounded by tiny diamonds. "It reminded me of your eyes," he explained sheepishly. I said yes through tears, coffee forgotten, as we held each other in that cramped kitchen where the ceiling still leaked when it rained. We decided on a small ceremony, family and close friends only. My sister was my maid of honor. My brother walked me down the aisle. We married in the community garden, where my mother used to take us on Sunday afternoons, the one place in my childhood that held purely happy memories. Daniel had it restored and filled with her favorite flowers as a wedding gift to me. The press caught wind of it, of course. Cinderella story, cleaner marries. CEO blared one particularly tactless headline, but by then I'd grown a thicker skin. Their narratives couldn't touch what we knew to be true. Moving into Daniel's penthouse afterward was like stepping into another dimension. Suddenly, I had a closet bigger than my entire former bedroom. A housekeeper came 3 times a week. A doorman greeted me by name. The first time I tried to clean up after dinner, Daniel gently took the sponge from my hand. "We can hire people for that now," he said. "Your days of cleaning up after others are over." But old habits die hard. I still made our bed each morning, still wiped down counters after use, still felt uncomfortable when people served me. Some nights I'd wake up in a panic, thinking I was late for my shift, before remembering that part of my life was behind me. The wealth was the hardest adjustment. The first time Daniel handed me a credit card connected to his accounts, I nearly gave it back. "Buy whatever you want," he said. "But what do you buy when you've spent your whole life carefully budgeting for necessities?" My first solo shopping trip was overwhelmingly. A saleswoman approached, eyeing my simple clothes with barely disguised disdain, until I reluctantly produced the card. At which point her attitude transformed so dramatically, it gave me emotional whiplash. I left with a single scarf I didn't particularly like, purchased only to escape the situation. "This isn't working," I told Daniel that night. "I don't know how to be this person, this wife of a CEO who lunches and shops and decorates." His response was to hire a life coach, not to transform me into someone else, but to help me navigate this new world while remaining authentically myself. Jessie, a down-to-earth woman who had herself married into wealth after growing up in poverty, became my guide and eventually my friend. "Take what serves you from this lifestyle," she advised, "and leave the rest." So I did. I embraced the security that money provided, but insisted on practical indulgences rather than showy ones. Instead of diamond necklaces, I asked Daniel for a college fund for my siblings. Instead of exotic vacations, I requested donations to the cancer center that had cared for my mother. I started a foundation providing education scholarships for young caregivers, like I had been. Some of Daniel's social circle accepted me immediately. Others kept their distance, clearly believing I was a gold digger who had somehow manipulated their friend. I learned to differentiate between genuine connection and polite tolerance, to recognize when I was being tested or patronized. There were painful moments, the charity gala, where a woman loudly wondered if I knew which fork to use, the board member's wife who helpfully explained basic business terms to me, assuming I wouldn't understand them, the old friend of Daniel's who drunkenly suggested I was sleeping my way to the top. But there were beautiful moments too, finding meaningful work with my foundation, watching my siblings flourish with educational opportunities they deserved, meeting other women who had crossed similar divides and forged authentic lives. Daniel proved my strongest advocate, never apologizing for my background, never trying to remake me into someone more suitable for his world. When a business associate made a snide comment about my former occupation, Daniel simply replied, "Yes, my wife worked harder than anyone I know to support her family. Her integrity and work ethic are exactly why I fell in love with her." The woman who had once cleaned offices now had offices of her own, with staff reporting to her as she expanded the foundation's reach. The girl who had once worried about paying rent now signed checks that changed lives. But inside, I was still Maria, still making mental calculations before purchases, still feeling the weight of responsibility toward my siblings, still waking up each day determined to make my mother proud. 1 year into our marriage, I returned to the office building where it had all begun. The night cleaning crew was just starting their shift. A young woman pushed a cart into the elevator, eyes tired but determined. I recognized that look, that posture, that resignation. "Hold the door, please," I said, stepping in beside her. She glanced at me, then away, as invisible as I had once felt. As we rode up together, I saw my past self reflected in her exhaustion, in the way she seemed to shrink into the corner to take up less space. When the doors opened, I passed her my business card. "If you're ever looking for a different opportunity," I said quietly, "my foundation could use someone who understands hard work." The surprise in her eyes, the same surprise I had felt when Daniel first truly saw me, felt like closing a circle, like passing forward the chance I had been given. Not the fairy tale, not the wealth, but the simple, profound gift of being seen as someone with potential beyond their current circumstances. Looking back at the journey that brought me here, I sometimes still catch myself in moments of disbelief. 3 years into marriage with Daniel, there are mornings I wake up in our penthouse and feel a momentary disconnection, like the universe accidentally placed Maria the cleaner into Maria Maxwell's life. But then Daniel's arm tightens around me, and I remember, this is real. All of it. The girl who once stretched a single packet of ramen into 2 meals now sits on charitable boards allocating millions in funding. The woman who used to count quarters for bus fare now has a driver on call. My siblings, now my greatest pride, are thriving. Tommy in his 2nd year of engineering school, Maria preparing for medical school interviews. When they visit, they move through this luxury with the same mixture of awe and adjustment that I still sometimes feel. But the most valuable transformation wasn't external. It wasn't about trading cleaning supplies for designer clothes or a cramped apartment for a penthouse. The real change happened internally. I learned that worth isn't determined by occupation or bank account. That invisible doesn't mean insignificant. That sometimes the most meaningful connections come from the most unexpected circumstances. Daniel and I still have our challenges. His world sometimes still feels foreign to me. There are social events where I catch whispers, notice glances, but I've learned to stand tall in rooms where others would prefer I disappear. I've earned my place, not through marriage, but through the strength that got me through those years of struggle, the resilience that kept my family together, the authenticity that allows me to navigate this new life without losing myself. People often ask if I miss anything about my old life. The honest answer is yes. I miss the simplicity sometimes. The clear metrics of success, floors cleaned, tasks completed, the uncomplicated relationships where expectations were straightforward. But I wouldn't trade what I have now. The opportunity to make real change in the world, the chance to ensure others don't face the same struggles I did, the partnership with a man who loves me for exactly who I am, rather than who he wishes I could be. Last month, I received a letter from a young woman working night shifts as a hospital cleaner while raising her younger brother. She'd heard about our foundation's caregiver scholarship program. "I never thought people like us could have second chances," she wrote. Reading her words, I remembered that feeling. The belief that certain doors were permanently closed to people from certain backgrounds. The conviction that fairy tales don't happen to girls who clean up after others. I called her personally the next day, not to tell her my story, but to listen to hers. Because if there's one thing I've learned, it's that everyone deserves to be truly seen, truly heard, regardless of their circumstances. Life can transform in ways you never expect. Remember that your current situation doesn't define your worth or your future. If this story resonated with you, share it with someone who needs to hear that unexpected love and opportunities can find you anywhere. Subscribe to hear more life-changing stories, and remember, sometimes the most beautiful journeys begin in the most ordinary places. Do I believe everyone will experience the specific path I've walked? Number. But I do believe that everyone deserves the chance to be valued for who they truly are. not for what job they hold or what circumstances they were born into. I believe in looking beyond labels and positions to see the humanity underneath. My story isn't about marrying into wealth. It's about two people who saw each other, really saw each other, when the rest of the world didn't bother to look. It's about finding love that transcends social boundaries. It's about building a bridge between worlds that seem impossibly far apart, and it all began with a spilled cup of coffee and a conversation that finally made me visible.